Hey everyone, today we're stepping into a 1960s American kitchen on a Sunday morning, where a heavy roasting pan waited beside a chrome-trimmed stove, a paper bag of potatoes rested on the Formica counter, and someone was already checking the clock before the family had finished dressing for church. Sunday dinner did not begin when the plates reached the table. In many homes it began before breakfast dishes were dry, with an oven warming a roast being seasoned, and the first rich smell of meat, onions, and pepper slowly replacing the scent of toast and coffee. The meal might be served hours later, but its schedule controlled the entire morning. Coats had to be found, children had to be dressed, and the cook had to calculate whether the main dish could be trusted alone while everyone was away. It was domestic timing performed without a timer on a phone, without a camera inside the oven, and often without anyone admitting how much could go wrong. If you enjoy remembering the foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions that once shaped American homes, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. Which Sunday dinner smell do you remember most clearly? And what dish did your family expect to find on the table after church or a quiet Sunday morning at home? For this list, a tradition is more than a recipe. It is a repeated action object rule, or expectation that made Sunday dinner feel different from an ordinary weekday meal. The first of those traditions was the early preparation itself, when the central dish entered the oven before the family left the house, turning the kitchen into a place where the day's most important work was already underway. The meat varied with region, income, season, and family custom. Some households prepared a beef or pork roast, others relied on a whole chicken, a ham, or a less expensive cut that became tender only after a long patient cooking. The cook might rub the surface with salt and pepper, add sliced onions, place carrots or potatoes around the edges, and pour in a little water or broth before fitting the lid or covering the pan. A recipe card might be consulted, but just as often the instructions lived in memory which pan held enough, how much liquid was safe, and whether the oven ran hotter than the dial claimed. Older ranges could have their own personalities. One heated slowly, another browned too quickly at the back, and one required a firm turn of the knob followed by a second look. The roast did not merely cook. It had to survive the household's absence without drying out scorching, or producing the kind of smoke that would greet everyone before they reached the front door. That possibility gave Sunday morning its small but persistent tension. While children struggled with buttons, collars, polished shoes, or hair that refused to remain neat, the person responsible for dinner was still moving between bedroom, hallway, and kitchen. The oven was checked one more time. A spoon might be used to move onions away from an exposed corner. The lid was lifted, then replaced, because checking the food was reassuring, even when it accomplished very little. In families that attended church, departure time could not simply be delayed until the roast looked cooperative. Services began when they began, and the household had to leave. In other homes, Sunday morning might involve visiting relatives, reading the newspaper, listening to a religious broadcast, or simply keeping the day quieter than the rest of the week. The details differed, but the basic arrangement remained familiar. A substantial meal was expected later, and someone had to begin it long before the rest of the family became hungry enough to care. When the door finally closed and the house became still, the oven continued the work. Fat softened. Onions collapsed into the pan juices. The surface of the meat darkened slowly and steam collected beneath the lid. The refrigerator hummed, the wall clock advanced, and the kitchen held a smell no one was there to enjoy yet. That smell became one of the strongest Sunday memory triggers because it marked the return home. A child entering first might notice it before removing a coat. Adults could often tell immediately whether the timing had worked. A deep, savoury aroma suggested that dinner was nearly ready. A sharper smell sent someone walking faster toward the stove. The cook opened the oven door, leaned back from the rush of heat, and inspected the pan with the seriousness of someone receiving news. If all had gone well, the roast had browned, the juices were bubbling, and the entire morning suddenly appeared organised. If it had not, Gravy would soon be asked to perform an act of mercy. The tradition depended on more than cooking skill. It depended on trust in familiar equipment knowledge built through repetition, and a willingness to organise Sunday around one large meal. It also reflected the household labour that often remained nearly invisible once everyone sat down. The finished roast looked calm on its platter, but the morning behind it had included planning shopping, thawing, trimming, seasoning, timing, and the mental calculation of how long the family could be away. In many households, that work fell mainly to women, although actual arrangements varied widely. Some husbands carved or tended the oven. Grandmothers brought experience. Older children peeled vegetables, set the table, or were assigned the important task of staying out of the kitchen at the wrong moment. The meal felt traditional because the same roles were repeated week after week until everyone knew where to stand, what to carry, and which instructions would arrive before they were spoken. By late morning or early afternoon, the roasting pan came out heavy and hot, its handles gripped through folded towels or thick pot holders. The meat rested while the remaining work accelerated. Potatoes were mashed, vegetables were warmed, rolls were covered, and the pan juices waited for their transformation into gravy. The family had returned, but Sunday dinner was still not ready to be eaten. It had merely reached its busiest stage. Soon the table would be set more carefully than on a weekday. The better serving dishes would appear, and everyone would begin asking the question that the cook had been answering since morning: what time are we eating? That question leads to the next Sunday tradition, because in many 1960s homes dinner arrived much earlier than modern families might expect, leaving the entire afternoon shaped by a meal that was already nearly finished before the day had properly begun. At 1 o'clock, the kitchen clock had become the most important object in the house. Sunday dinner in many 1960s families was not the evening meal at all, but the largest meal of the day, served around noon or in the early afternoon. The exact hour varied by region, church schedule, family custom, and how long the roast required, yet the rhythm was familiar. A small breakfast, a busy morning, and then a table filled much earlier than it would have been on Monday. Children who normally heard dinner at 5 or 6 might discover that Sunday dinner arrived while the sunlight was still bright across the curtains. The timing made the meal feel both formal and slightly confusing. It was too late to be lunch, too early to be supper, and large enough to make both unnecessary for several hours. Adults understood the arrangement. Children mostly understood that they had been told not to spoil their appetite. The words themselves carried regional history. In some households, especially in rural communities and parts of the South and Midwest, dinner meant the main meal regardless of the hour, while supper referred to the lighter meal eaten later. In other homes, lunch was lunch and dinner remained firmly attached to evening. Families could live only a few streets apart and use the same words differently, producing small misunderstandings whenever someone invited company. Come for Sunday dinner might mean 12:30 in one family and 5 o'clock in another. No national rule settled the matter. The clock, the local custom, and the person doing the cooking decided. What mattered was that Sunday's main meal occupied the centre of the day. Morning activities led toward it, and the afternoon unfolded from it. The family did not simply pause for food. The meal divided Sunday into a before and an after. Serving the meal early required its own kind of planning. Breakfast was often kept modest because a heavy plate was coming. Toast, eggs, cereal, coffee, or juice might be enough, especially when the kitchen was already occupied by roasting pans and peeled vegetables. Then came the dangerous stretch between breakfast and dinner, when children began opening cabinets asking for crackers, or circling the kitchen with the expression of people who had not eaten in several years. The answer was often the same: dinner would be ready soon. Soon might mean 45 minutes, which to a child in church clothes was approximately the length of winter. A slice of bread, a glass of milk, or a stern reminder could be used to protect the appetite everyone seemed deeply concerned about. The rule made practical sense. Sunday dinner required time, money, and effort, and no cook wanted the family arriving at the table already full from cookies. Once the serving bowls appeared, the early hour allowed the meal to proceed without the weekday rush. There was usually no school bus coming, no factory whistle ending a shift at the same moment, and fewer evening deadlines pressing against the table. The family could eat slowly past dishes twice and remain seated while adults continued talking. In homes shaped by church attendance, the schedule often followed the end of morning services. In other families, the timing made room for an afternoon drive, a baseball game on the radio, visiting relatives' yard work, or simply a nap in a chair that no one officially planned to take. Sunday dinner became the day's fixed point because so many other activities could be arranged around it. The meal was large enough to deserve attention, but early enough to leave several hours afterward, although those hours were frequently spent recovering from the attention the meal had received. The early dinner also created a second tradition later in the day, Sunday supper, which was often much lighter and less formal. By 5 or 6 o'clock, someone might admit to being hungry again, but few households wished to repeat the full performance. The roast had already been carved. The serving dishes had been washed or were still waiting beside the sink. What followed could be sandwiches made from leftover meat bread with butter, cold chicken soup, crackers, fruit cake, cereal, or whatever could be placed on the table without beginning another campaign. In some homes, each person found something independently. In others, the family gathered again for a smaller meal. Sunday supper had none of dinner's ceremonial confidence. It arrived quietly, often on ordinary plates with fewer vegetables and almost no interest in matching serving bowls. After a midday feast, a sandwich could feel like a perfectly reasonable conclusion. This two-meal rhythm revealed how differently Sunday could organize hunger. Weekdays followed work, school, and transportation schedules. Sunday followed tradition. The main meal appeared when the family expected it, even if the clock seemed unusual to outsiders. Children learned that the word dinner did not always belong to darkness, and that a meal eaten at 1 o'clock could still require the best behavior of the week. Adults learned to judge the entire day backward from the serving time: when to start the meat, when to leave the house, when to mash the potatoes, and when to call everyone to the table. The arrangement survived because it made practical use of a slower day, and because families repeated it until it felt natural. Yet timing alone did not make Sunday dinner special. When the food was finally ready, the table itself often changed. A cloth was unfolded, better dishes were lifted from a cabinet, and ordinary furniture began preparing for its weekly promotion. The tablecloth often came out before the serving bowls folded into a square that still carried the sharp lines of the linen closet. In many 1960s, home's Sunday dinner gave the dining table a different appearance from the one it wore during the week. A white cloth, a patterned cotton covering, or a carefully pressed damask cloth could hide scratches, water rings, and the ordinary evidence of homework, breakfast, and household accounts. It also announced that the meal mattered. The cloth had usually been washed, dried, ironed, folded, and stored by someone whose work disappeared the moment it was spread smoothly across the table. Corners were pulled, even wrinkles were flattened with the palm, and children were warned not to drag their hands along the edge. The table had not changed, but it suddenly expected better behavior. A chair that held a school sweater on Saturday could become a formal place by Sunday afternoon, simply because a cloth had been placed beneath the plates. The dishes could change as well. Some families owned a set of china reserved for Sunday's holidays or company, while others used the same everyday plates but added better serving bowls, glass tumblers, cloth napkins, or a gravy boat that spent most of the week waiting behind a cabinet door. Income, family history, and household space shaped what the good dishes actually meant. They might be wedding china, inexpensive patterned plates collected over time, dishes inherited from a relative, or simply the set without chips around the rim. Matching was admired, but complete matching was not always available. A family table could contain 6 plates from one pattern, 2 from another, and a serving platter that had survived longer than anyone remembered. What made the dishes special was often not their price. It was the rule that they were handled carefully, washed separately, and returned to a particular shelf where children were not encouraged to experiment. Setting the Sunday table required more pieces than a weekday meal usually received. Forks were placed beside plates instead of gathered in a jar. Knives appeared even when the meat would arrive already carved. Spoons waited for vegetables, dessert, or coffee depending on the household. Salt and pepper shakers were filled. The butter dish was carried from the refrigerator, and drinking glasses were arranged where small elbows could threaten them most efficiently. A centerpiece might be modest: flowers from the yard, a bowl of fruit candles that were rarely lit or nothing at all, because the serving dishes needed every available inch. The table had to look generous, but it also had to function. Large bowls of potatoes, vegetables, bread, and gravy were coming, and decorative ambition usually surrendered when the roast platter arrived. Sunday dinner encouraged formality, but potatoes still required room. The tablecloth also created one of the meal's quiet tensions. It made the table attractive while giving every spill a larger stage. Gravy did not merely fall, it landed on white fabric. A glass of milk could spread under plates, reach the folded napkins, and become a family event before anyone found a towel. Children were reminded to keep cups away from the edge-pass bowls with both hands and avoid pulling the cloth while adjusting their chairs. Adults were not immune. Coffee rings, buttermarks, beet juice, and the small dark drops from a serving spoon could all remain after the meal, as evidence that the table had been used properly. The cloth was meant to protect the furniture, but it also created laundry that would later require soaking stain treatment, drying, and ironing. Sunday dignity had a maintenance schedule, and someone would meet it on Monday. In households with limited space, creating a formal table could require rearranging half the room. A dining table might be extended with hidden leaves moved away from the wall, or supplemented with a card table for children. Chairs came from bedrooms, desks, porches, or neighbours. The best cloth might fit the main table, while the smaller one received a clean sheet or a different covering. Formality adjusted itself to the number of relatives expected through the door. Some families ate in a separate dining room used mainly for company and Sunday meals. Others transformed the kitchen table, clearing away the bread box, grocery list newspapers, and school papers that normally occupied it. The distinction was not between families who cared and families who did not. It was between different homes, budgets, floor plans, and traditions. A carefully wiped table with ordinary plates could carry as much ceremony as a cabinet full of china. Once everyone sat down, the cloth and dishes became part of the memory without demanding much attention. People remembered the blue flowers around the plate, the heavy platter placed before the carver, the glass bowl that showed the colour of the vegetables, or the napkin that had to remain in a lap. These objects gave Sunday dinner continuity. The menu might change from chicken to ham, relatives might come and go, and children might move from the small table to the adult one, but the same serving bowl could return for years. Its presence told the family where they were in the week and what behaviour the table expected. Yet before anyone could take the first helping, many households observed another pause. Hands stopped moving, heads lowered, and the food waited while Grace placed a few quiet seconds between the work of preparing dinner and the permission to begin. The serving bowls were on the table, the gravy gave off a thin ribbon of steam, and the butter had begun to soften beneath its glass cover. But in many 1960s homes no one reached for a fork yet. A parent, grandparent, or visiting relative lowered a head, and the movement travelled around the table until hands became still and conversation stopped. Grace might last only a few seconds, spoken in words so familiar that children could repeat them without thinking, or it might expand into a longer prayer that included absent relatives' illness work, whether soldiers overseas, or gratitude for the food now cooling within reach. The roast had taken hours. The potatoes had been mashed at the last possible moment, yet the meal paused before its first bite, as though the household needed one quiet line between preparation and eating. For a hungry child staring at a warm roll, this pause could feel less like spiritual reflection and more like a test conducted beside butter. The form of grace differed widely. Some Protestant families used a brief memorized blessing. Catholic households might begin and end with the sign of the cross. Other Christian families invited the father, mother, grandfather, or oldest guest to speak freely. Jewish families followed different blessings and meal customs, while many households of other faiths or no religion did not perform this ritual at all. Even among families who prayed, Sunday grace could be more formal than the version heard on weekdays. The better dishes were out, relatives might be present, and the meal carried the atmosphere of an occasion. A child who could rush through a Wednesday blessing in one breath might be expected to sit quietly, while an adult offered thanks with greater care. The tradition was never as uniform as nostalgic pictures sometimes suggest, but where it existed, it gave the table a rhythm everyone recognized. Food arrived. Chairs settled, heads bowed, words were spoken, and only then did the serving begin. The person chosen to lead the prayer often revealed the family's quiet order. A grandfather might begin automatically because he was the oldest. A father might be expected to speak because custom placed him at the head of the table. A mother who had planned and cooked the meal might offer grace, especially when she regularly guided the household's religious life. A visiting minister, priest, or respected guest could be invited, making the children wonder whether the potatoes would still be hot by the final amen. In some homes, a child was asked to say the blessing, usually after being given enough warning to become deeply nervous. The familiar words could suddenly disappear from memory while every adult waited kindly and every sibling waited less kindly. When the child finally finished, the relief around the table was almost as noticeable as the gratitude. Grace taught reverence, but it also taught public speaking under the supervision of gravy. The physical rules were simple and therefore closely observed. Hands might be folded, held together, placed in laps, or joined with the people on either side. Hats had already been removed. Children were expected not to open their eyes, whisper, kick the table leg, or quietly move a roll closer to their plates. The smell of browned meat and onions made stillness more difficult. A spoon settling into a serving bowl could produce a tiny metallic sound, followed by the sharp awareness that someone had moved too soon. In households with strict table manners, reaching before the prayer ended was not treated as innocent enthusiasm. It was a failure to respect the meal, the speaker, and the family ritual. The correction might be only a look, but Sunday tables were highly efficient places for looks. One raised eyebrow could return a child's hand to the lap faster than a full lecture. Grace also recognized something, that the finished table could easily conceal the work and uncertainty behind the food. The prayer might thank God for abundance, but many families knew that abundance had required careful, shopping garden produce, preserved food, inexpensive cuts of meat, or portions stretched to serve several people. A full platter did not necessarily mean the grocery budget had been generous. It might mean the cook had chosen well-saved pan drippings, added potatoes, baked bread, or arrange the food so that no empty space appeared. In farm households, the blessing could connect the meal to weather crops, livestock, and labour. In urban or suburban homes, the food had travelled through supermarkets, butcher counters, freezers, and paper grocery bags, but its arrival still felt worthy of thanks. The prayer did not erase the labour of the person who cooked. At its best, it acknowledged that the meal depended on more than the appetite waiting to consume it. For some children, the words of grace stayed in memory long after the exact menu disappeared. They remembered a grandfather's voice, a grandmother squeezing a hand, the scrape of a chair, as a late relative hurried into place, or the collective response that released everyone toward the food. They also remembered the awkward Sundays when a guest followed a different custom, when no one knew who should begin, or when a prayer grew unexpectedly long, while steam vanished from the vegetables. These moments showed that the ritual was both sacred and practical, carried out by ordinary people at a crowded table. It created a pause, established order, and reminded the family that eating together meant more than satisfying hunger. But even after the final amen, the meal could not begin immediately. The cook still had to reach the table, the youngest child had to stop shifting in the chair, and every place had to be filled before the first serving spoon began its journey. The empty chair mattered almost as much as the filled plate. In many 1960s, household Sunday dinner did not officially begin when the food reached the table. It began when the last family member finally sat down. The roast might already be sliced, the potatoes might be losing steam, and a child might be watching butter melt into a roll with painful concentration, but lifting a fork too early could bring the entire meal to a halt. Everyone was expected to be present, the cook who had returned to the kitchen for the gravy, the father washing his hands after checking something outside the grandparent moving carefully from the living room, and the youngest child who had somehow disappeared at the exact moment dinner was announced. Waiting was presented as good manners, but it also carried a larger message. Sunday dinner belonged to the whole table. One person's hunger did not outrank another person's place. The person most likely to be missing was often the one who had prepared the meal. While everyone else settled into chairs, the cook was still carrying bowls, searching for a serving spoon, turning off a burner, wiping a spill, or remembering the rolls left inside the oven. A plate might have been set for her, but the work continued around it. In many homes, children learned that eating before she sat down was especially disrespectful. She had spent the morning making the meal possible, and the family was expected to wait until she could participate in it. Reality did not always match the ideal. Some cooks urged everyone to begin before the food cooled, then spent the first several minutes standing serving and returning to the kitchen. Others insisted that nothing move until they were seated. Household arrangements varied, but the tension was familiar. The meal was supposed to gather the family, yet the person responsible for gathering it could be the last one allowed to stop working. Finding everyone could become a small Sunday ritual of its own. Someone called from the dining room. Another voice answered from upstairs. A screen door opened and a child who'd been told not to change out of church clothes returned from the yard with evidence that the instruction had been misunderstood. A relative on the telephone promised to come immediately and continued talking. The radio was lowered, the newspaper folded, and the television, where one was playing, competed with the announcement that dinner was ready. On weekdays, family members might eat in shifts because of work-school activities or transportation schedules. Sunday dinner was expected to resist that fragmentation. The table waited because eating together was part of the meal's purpose. This could be comforting when everyone wanted to be there, and irritating when one person seemed determined to test how long mashed potatoes could remain attractive. Seating order also carried quiet rules. Parents or grandparents often had familiar places that no one needed to label. A guest might be given a comfortable chair, or placed near the person most likely to keep conversation moving. Young children sat where an adult could reach a cup before it tipped. Older children might discover that the place they occupied for years had been reassigned when a relative arrived. In larger gatherings, the main table could not hold everyone, and a children's table appeared nearby with lighter chairs, simpler dishes, and supervision conducted from a distance. Moving from that smaller table to the adult table could feel like a family promotion, although it came with longer conversations and fewer opportunities to exchange unwanted vegetables unnoticed. The arrangement reflected age, hospitality authority, and available space, all expressed through chairs pulled close to one another. Waiting until everyone was seated taught more than patience. It taught children to notice the needs of other people. A bowl was not passed until the person beside it was ready. A guest was not left standing while the family began eating. An elderly relative might need help settling into a chair, and a toddler might require a cushion bib or plate moved beyond immediate danger. The rule also gave the household a brief opportunity to inspect itself. Were all the utensils present? Had the butter reached the table? Was there a glass at every place? Had anyone forgotten the salt napkins or gravy? Once the meal began sending someone back to the kitchen, interrupted the careful order. Of course, something was almost always missing. Sunday dinner could involve 6 serving dishes and still be delayed by 1 spoon. The family waited while the spoon was found because civilization apparently depended on the peas having the correct equipment. Not every household enforced the rule with equal formality. In some families, children could begin once the adults gave permission. In others, guests were served first, followed by older relatives, adults, and children. Some cooks placed food directly onto plates in the kitchen, reducing the delay, but creating a line of completed meals waiting for their owners. Families with infants shift workers' illness-limited dining space, or different cultural customs developed arrangements that suited their circumstances. The idealized image of every American family seated at one polished table never represented everyone. Yet the expectation of shared presence remained powerful because the 1960s were already bringing changes that made synchronized meals more difficult. Longer commutes, varied work hours, school activities and television schedules competed with the dining table. Sunday dinner became one of the places where families tried to hold the old rhythm a little longer. When the final person finally sat, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Grace had been said, or a parent simply nodded, and hands moved toward the serving bowls. The waiting ended with the scrape of spoons against potatoes, the soft clink of dishes, and the first request to pass the bread. No announcement was necessary. Everyone understood that the table was complete, and the meal could now belong to them together. But what arrived at the center of that table carried its own expectation. Sunday dinner could not always rely on an ordinary skillet meal or a collection of leftovers. The main dish was often expected to appear substantial, carefully presented and worthy of the hours surrounding it. The family had taken its places. Now the food had to look like occasion. The main dish usually entered the dining room on the largest platter the household owned. In many 1960s, families' Sunday dinner needed a centerpiece that looked more important than anything served during the working week. A whole roasted chicken, a browned beef, roast a baked ham, or a pork roast surrounded by onions and potatoes could provide that visual authority. The dish did not have to be expensive, and it was not the same in every region or household. What mattered was that it appeared substantial, carefully prepared, and capable of feeding everyone seated around the table. Tuesday supper might arrive from an electric skillet or a saucepan placed near the stove. Sunday's main dish was lifted with both hands, carried past the chairs and positioned where everyone could see it. The platter announced that the meal had required planning. It also quietly challenged the cook to make one piece of meat look generous enough for family relatives, second helpings, and the possibility that someone had brought an appetite larger than expected. Appearance mattered because Sunday dinner was partly a performance of abundance. A modest roast could be surrounded with carrots, potatoes, onions, or parsley, so that the platter looked full. A chicken was presented whole before being divided, allowing crisp skin and browned wings to receive their moment of admiration. Ham might arrive, scored across the surface, sometimes decorated for a holiday or special gathering, though elaborate magazine-style presentations were hardly universal. Families working within a careful grocery budget relied on arrangement as much as quantity. The serving dish was chosen to fit the food rather than expose too much empty space. Slices were cut thinly when more relatives appeared than planned. Vegetables and bread carried part of the burden. The result could look plentiful even when the cook already knew exactly how many portions the meat would produce. Sunday dinner taught an old household lesson. Generosity was not always the same as unlimited supply. Sometimes it was the skill of making what was available appear welcoming. The choice of centerpiece reflected geography, income, family heritage, and what local stores or farms made accessible. Beef roast could signal a particularly substantial meal in some homes, while pork ham, chicken pot roast meatloaf, or a regional specialty held the place of honor elsewhere. A farm family might serve meat connected to its own seasonal work. An urban family could rely on the neighborhood butcher, a supermarket meat counter, or a cut selected according to that week's price. Some households ate chicken frequently enough that it did not seem luxurious, while others remembered it as a Sunday meal because serving a whole bird created an occasion. African American immigrant, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Southern Midwestern, Northeastern, Western, rural and urban households brought different traditions to the weekly table. The shared custom was not one national recipe. It was the expectation that the main food should carry family identity and make the table feel more complete than an ordinary weekday meal. The centerpiece also displayed the difference between tenderness and cost. Less expensive cuts often needed time, moisture, and steady heat, which made them well suited to a long Sunday morning. Slow cooking softened connective tissue and allowed onions, drippings, and seasonings to build flavor, while the household attended church, visited relatives, or completed other routines. Pot roast was especially useful because its appearance suggested abundance even when the cut had been chosen for economy. Once browned and surrounded by vegetables, it seemed to have planned the entire meal itself. The truth was less convenient. Someone had selected it, prepared. It watched the oven, tested it with a fork, and calculated when to begin the potatoes. Old advertisements often promised that the right range roasting pan seasoning mix or packaged ingredient would make such meals nearly effortless. The roast generally declined to cooperate with the word effortless. Bringing the main dish to the table created a moment of inspection. Adults noticed whether the meat had browned evenly. Children looked for the portion they hoped to receive. Guests offered compliments before tasting, partly from kindness, and partly because that was how hospitality worked. The cook might dismiss the praise, mention that the roast had cooked faster than expected, or explain that the butcher had provided a different cut. These remarks were not merely conversation. They released some of the tension that had accumulated since morning. The dish was finished, it had not burned, and it looked worthy of the better plates. Even when the surface was darker than planned, or the chicken had surrendered part of its skin to the pan gravy carving, and strategic placement could protect the presentation. Once sliced, a small flaw became difficult to identify. Sunday dinner possessed many forms of forgiveness, and most of them involved sauce. Children often understood the hierarchy of the main dish before they understood the budget behind it. They knew that certain pieces were requested, certain pieces were assigned, and reaching directly toward the platter was not permitted. A child might hope for a drumstick, the end slice of ham, or a piece without visible fat. An adult decided whether that hope matched the needs of the table. Guests were often offered desirable portions first. Older relatives might receive tender slices. Younger children were given amounts they were expected to finish. The person serving had to balance preference with fairness, while pretending that the arrangement required no thought at all. Second helpings usually waited until everyone had received a first portion. The platter remained at the center of the table as both promise and inventory, and experienced family members could estimate what remained without appearing to count. The main dish carried emotional meaning because it represented effort made visible. A casserole might hide its ingredients beneath crumbs or cheese, but a roast chicken or ham displayed the result of time directly. Its browned surface suggested patience, attention, and the desire to make Sunday feel different. That desire did not mean every meal succeeded, or every family enjoyed gathering. Meat could be dry, children could complain, guests could arrive late, and arguments could continue beneath polite requests for bread. Yet the platter still represented an attempt to create order and occasion around the table. It gave the family something central to share even when their tastes and temperaments did not match. Before anyone could receive a slice, however, the centerpiece had to be divided. The carving knife was brought forward, the platter was turned toward the person expected to use it, and conversation briefly shifted toward the practical question of where the first cut should be made. The main dish had made its entrance. Now Sunday dinner moved into another small ceremony, one performed with a long knife, a carving fork, and several people quietly hoping the person in charge knew what they were doing. The carving knife rarely appeared alone. Beside it came a long two-pronged fork, a heavy platter, and the attention of everyone waiting for the first slice. In many 1960s homes, carving the Sunday roast ham, turkey, or chicken became a small ceremony performed at the table or just inside the kitchen doorway. The person trusted with the knife often occupied a familiar seat and knew or was expected to know where the blade should enter. Conversation softened while the platter was turned, the meat steadied, and the first careful cut exposed the inside. Children watched because carving determined which pieces would reach them. Adults watched because a roast could be made to serve generously or disappear with surprising speed. The knife was not simply dividing food. It was dividing preference, status, appetite, and the grocery budget into portions that had to look fair. In many families, a father or grandfather handled the carving, while a mother, grandmother, or another cook managed the serving bowls and directed the meal. Period advertisements and etiquette guides often presented this division as natural, but real households were less uniform. Some women carved because they had cooked the meat and understood it best. Some men preferred to avoid the task entirely. A skilled aunt, older sibling, or family friend might take over when the usual carver was absent. What mattered was familiarity and confidence. The person holding the knife had to know how to separate a chicken joint without sending it across the table, how to slice against the grain, and how to keep a hot platter from sliding across the cloth. The role carried a little authority, although that authority could weaken quickly if the first slice was thick enough to serve as building material. The tools themselves often had a sense of occasion. A carving set might have been received as a wedding gift and stored in a fitted box protected from the ordinary kitchen drawer where smaller knives knocked against bottle openers and measuring spoons. Some handles were dark wood, moulded plastic, faux bone, or metal polished before company arrived. Other households used the sharpest available kitchen knife and a serving fork that had already performed several unrelated duties that morning. The distinction between formal equipment and practical improvisation depended on income space and family custom. A matching set looked impressive, but sharpness mattered more. A dull blade, crushed rather than sliced, pulled the meat away from the fork and forced the carver to apply enough pressure to make nearby water glasses seem temporarily unsafe. Sunday dignity could survive mismatched dishes. It had more difficulty surviving a knife that refused to cut. Carving a whole chicken required a different knowledge from slicing a roast. Legs and wings had to be located at the joint's breast meat cut away in even slices, and the remaining portions assigned according to family preference. Children often developed strong loyalties to particular pieces. One wanted a drumstick because it had a handle. Another wanted white meat because it looked simpler. Someone else preferred the crisp skin and showed less interest in what was underneath it. The carver had to remember these preferences while also serving guests first, reserving tender pieces for older relatives and ensuring that no child received a portion too large to finish. A roast created another problem: thickness. Generous slices pleased the first people served but reduced the certainty of second helpings. Thin slices stretched farther, especially when placed beside potatoes and covered with gravy. The best carver made this arithmetic nearly invisible. Ham brought its own ritual. The knife followed the shape of the bone, releasing pink slices with browned edges, while someone nearby asked whether anyone wanted the end piece. Fat could be trimmed or left according to preference, and the most attractive slices were arranged on plates before less cooperative sections were addressed. With beef or pork, the carver checked doneness while trying not to announce concern. The centre might be pinker than one relative preferred, or drier than the cook had hoped. At that point, the family entered a period of polite interpretation. One person called it tender. Another requested an outside slice. Gravy moved closer. Sunday dinner rarely required everyone to agree about the meat. It required everyone to behave as though the person holding the knife had produced the best possible result from the circumstances. The ceremony also revealed the household's order of service. Guests usually received an early choice. Grandparents might be asked which cut they preferred. Adults were served before younger children in some families, while other households made sure children received food quickly enough to remain seated. The carver and cook often ate last their own plates, receiving the less symmetrical pieces after everyone else had been considered. This could look like simple hospitality, but it also demonstrated how much judgment was involved in serving a family meal. The person carving counted portions without appearing to count. The cook watched the platter, the side dishes, and the number of people still waiting. A small nod could signal that slices should become thinner. A raised serving spoon could direct more potatoes toward a plate that had received less meat. The meal was being balanced in real time. Once every plate held a portion, the knife rested beside the platter, but remained close enough for second helpings. Conversation returned, bowls resumed their movement, and the first judgments about tenderness began. The carving ceremony had converted one impressive centerpiece into individual meals, each slightly different but meant to feel equally considered. It also left behind scraps, bones, drippings, and smaller pieces that would later become sandwiches, soup hash, or Monday's supper. Nothing useful was surrendered merely because it lacked the shape of a proper slice. But before those leftovers could begin another meal, the roasting pan still held something too valuable to waste. Browned bits clung to the bottom, fat floated above concentrated juices, and a spoon waited beside a bag of flour or a measuring cup. The knife had divided the meat. Now the drippings would be turned into the sauce expected to unite everything else on the Sunday plate. The roasting pan looked almost empty after the meat had been lifted away, but the dark liquid and browned fragments at the bottom were often treated as the beginning of something important. In many 1960s kitchens, pan drippings became the foundation of Sunday gravy made while the roast rested and the family waited in the next room. The cook tipped the pan, carefully judged the amount of fat by sight, and scraped loose the bits that had attached themselves to the metal during the long morning. A wooden spoon-wire whisk or flat-edged spatula moved through the mixture, while flour waited nearby in a canister or measuring cup. Nothing about the process appeared especially glamorous. The pan was hot, the stove was crowded, and formal clothes were dangerously close to splattering fat. Yet this final work could determine whether the entire meal felt rich, moist, and complete. A roast might receive the praise, but gravy often performed the rescue. Recipes varied from household to household. Some cooks stirred flour directly into the fat to form a smooth paste, before adding water, broth milk, or liquid from cooked vegetables. Others shook flour and cold water together in a jar, hoping the lid was secure, then poured the mixture slowly into the simmering drippings. Cornstarch appeared in some kitchens, while others relied on commercial gravy mixes when time was short, or the roasting pan offered too little liquid. The measurements were not always written down. Experienced cooks watched the spoon the bubbles and the trail left across the bottom of the pan. Too thin and the gravy ran around the plate like brown water. Too thick and it could stand beside the potatoes with the confidence of pudding. A little more liquid corrected one problem. More cooking corrected the other. Lumps required faster stirring, patient straining, or a household agreement not to examine the gravy too closely. The flavour depended on what had happened beneath the roast. Onions softened into sweetness. Meat juices concentrated. Salt, pepper and seasonings collected in the pan, along with the dark browned residue that carried much of the flavour. Water or broth loosened these bits, and the spoon worked them back into the sauce instead of surrendering them to the dishpan. This was thrift expressed through technique. The part that looked burned onto the metal could become the most valued part of the meal, provided it had browned rather than truly scorched. When the line had been crossed, the cook usually knew before tasting. A bitter smell rose from the pan, and the family's future became more dependent on packaged stock kitchen seasoning or the forgiving power of mashed potatoes. Sunday dinner had room for recovery, but no amount of flour could persuade burned drippings to forget what they had become. Once smooth enough to serve, the gravy moved into a bowl pitcher or proper gravy boat. Some households owned one that matched the better dishes with a narrow spout and a curved handle that made the sauce look more formal than it had 5 minutes earlier in the roasting pan. Others used a small bowl and ladle a glass measuring cup or whatever vessel poured without causing disaster. The gravy boat often sat near an adult because children could not always be trusted with warm sauce, white tablecloths, and the belief that more was automatically better. It travelled carefully around the table, leaving a line of brown over meat potatoes stuffing biscuits or bread. Someone usually asked for it again before it had completed the first trip. The vessel might look ceremonial, but its working conditions were severe. It was lifted, tilted, emptied, refilled, and wiped at the spout with the urgency of an object that had underestimated the family. Gravy connected the different parts of the plate. A slice of roast that had cooked slightly too long became tender enough when covered. Plain potatoes acquired the flavour of the meat without requiring another expensive ingredient. Bread absorbed what remained, and vegetables sometimes received gravy whether they had requested it or not. For children, the sauce could disguise textures they disliked, or create a small lake around foods that were expected to be eaten. Adults used it more strategically, stretching flavour from the main dish, across cheaper and more plentiful sides. That made gravy part of the household economy as well as the menu. A limited amount of meat could still produce a satisfying plate when its drippings flavoured the potatoes and bread beside it. The sauce did not create more food, but it made the meal feel more unified and generous. There were rules around gravy even when no one stated them formally. It was poured rather than spooned directly from the communal dish. The person nearest the boat passed it when asked instead of keeping it stationed beside one plate. Children were expected to use enough restraint that the sauce remained on the food and not on sleeves, tablecloth, or chair seats. Taking the last of it without checking could earn the same look reserved for taking the final roll. Guests might be encouraged to have more while the cook quietly wondered whether enough remained for second helpings and Monday's leftovers. If the boat ran dry, someone carried it back to the kitchen and scraped the saucepan again. The second filling was sometimes thinner than the first. This was rarely announced. After the meal, the remaining gravy was not automatically discarded. If it could be cooled and stored safely, it might return with reheated meat, cover an open-faced sandwich, enrich a stew, or help form the base of another supper. The roasting pan itself went into hot water, where the same browned bits that had been valuable during cooking became stubborn evidence during cleanup. Before that work began, however, the gravy boat continued its slow circuit around the Sunday table. Each pass led it toward the largest bowl in the room where potatoes waited in pale mounds for the sauce they had been prepared to receive. The roast may have supplied the occasion, but the potato bowl supplied the certainty that everyone could leave the table full. The potato bowl often seemed larger than any other serving dish on the Sunday table, and for good reason. In many 1960s, households' potatoes were the dependable centre of the plate, even when the roast received top billing. They were affordable, filling, familiar, and willing to accept nearly every flavour the kitchen could produce. Mashed potatoes were especially common because they could be prepared in a quantity large enough for family relatives, and the second helpings everyone claimed they did not need. The bowl arrived warm and heavy, sometimes made of glass china or sturdy earthenware, with a serving spoon resting against a mound marked by the final strokes of the masher. A small hollow might be pressed into the centre for butter, which melted slowly before disappearing beneath the first ladle of gravy. The roast announced that Sunday was special. The potato bowl made certain nobody left hungry. Preparing enough potatoes began long before the bowl reached the table. A paper sack was brought from the pantry cellar or lower kitchen cabinet, and the cook began judging quantity by size experience and the number of chairs expected at dinner. Potatoes were peeled over a sink bowl or newspaper spread across the counter, leaving thin curls of skin and pale wet surfaces that darkened if left too long. In some families, an older child was assigned the peeling, a job that appeared simple until too much potato disappeared with each strip. Another child might cut the peeled pieces into roughly equal chunks, although roughly often described the results more accurately than equal. The pieces went into a large pot of salted water and boiled until a fork entered easily. Timing mattered. If cooked too soon, they sat in water and became heavy. If started too late, the meat rested while everyone waited for potatoes that still resisted the fork. Mashed potatoes required a brief period of determined work at the busiest moment in the kitchen. The drained pieces released clouds of steam, while butter, warm milk, evaporated milk cream, or whatever the household normally used was added. A hand masher pressed down again and again its metal head, leaving ridges through the softening mixture. Some kitchens used an electric mixer for a smoother result, while others preferred potatoes with enough texture to prove they had once been whole. Salt was added, perhaps pepper, and the cook tasted quickly before reaching for more milk. Too little liquid left the potatoes stiff. Too much turned them loose enough to spread across the plate without permission. Families had strong opinions about lumps, but those opinions usually became most vocal after someone else had completed the mashing. Not every Sunday potato was mashed. Roast potatoes could cook beside the meat, absorbing drippings and browning along their edges. Scallop potatoes appeared in baking dishes layered with milk sauce onions or cheese, requiring their own oven space and schedule. Boiled potatoes might be served with butter and parsley, especially when the cook wanted a simpler side. Sweet potatoes held an important place in many regional and family traditions, prepared plainly mashed candied, or baked in a casserole. The exact dish depended on geography, culture, season, cost, and the main course. Yet ordinary white potatoes remained a powerful household tool because they could change form without losing familiarity. They might appear mashed on Sunday, sliced into a skillet on Monday, and return as cakes, hash soup, or the filling beneath leftover gravy before the week was finished. At the table, potatoes helped manage the portions of more expensive food. A child receiving a smaller slice of roast could still have a generous spoonful from the large bowl. An adult serving plates might place potatoes, first add meat beside them, and then use vegetables and bread to complete the arrangement. This was not necessarily presented as thrift. It simply looked like a proper meal. The potatoes' mild flavour carried butter, salt, meat juices, and gravy, spreading the taste of the centerpiece across a larger portion of the plate. A modest amount of meat could feel substantial when every bite was accompanied by something warm and filling. Families watching the grocery budget understood this even if no one discussed it aloud. The potato bowl was not decorative abundance. It was practical abundance built from an ingredient that worked hard without insisting on attention. Children often had an easier relationship with potatoes than with the vegetables waiting elsewhere on the table. Mashed potatoes were soft, warm, and easily shaped with a fork. They could become a wall intended to hold back gravy, a crater filled with butter, or a carefully flattened surface where peas were hidden one at a time. Adults generally preferred that they remain food rather than construction material. A child might request potatoes without gravy, then change their mind after the boat had moved away. Another might take an enormous serving and discover halfway through the meal that the clean plate rule had not been suspended for Sunday. The first helping was usually generous, but second helpings carried a quieter test. Everyone had to receive enough before one person returned to the bowl. Reaching for the last spoonful without asking could turn a popular side dish into a lesson about manners. The cook watched the level in the bowl with nearly the same attention given to the meat platter. Too much left over suggested that portions had been misjudged, although leftovers were rarely a serious problem. Too little meant someone might have to choose bread instead. An experienced cook often prepared more than seemed necessary because potatoes were inexpensive insurance against an unexpected guest or an unusually hungry teenager. The bowl could be refilled from the pot if extra remained in the kitchen, and no one at the table needed to know that the first serving dish had been calculated carefully. Sunday dinner was supposed to feel generous, not measured. The potato bowl helped create that feeling while quietly absorbing the household's uncertainty. By the end of the meal, streaks of potato clung to the inside of the bowl, and the serving spoon rested against a portion too small for another full helping but too useful to waste. It might be scraped into a refrigerator container covered with wax paper or foil and saved for another meal. Before that happened, however, the Sunday plate still needed colour. Beside the pale potatoes and brown gravy waited green beans, peas, corn, carrots, greens, or whatever vegetable the family considered necessary to complete dinner. The potato bowl had promised fullness. The next serving dish promised that the meal would also look properly balanced, whether the children welcomed that promise or not. The vegetable bowls usually arrived in colours that made the rest of the Sunday plate look properly arranged. Beside brown, roast pale potatoes and glossy gravy green beans, peas, corn, carrots, greens, or another familiar vegetable supplied the part of dinner that adults described as necessary, and children sometimes regarded as negotiable. In many 1960s homes, a complete meal was expected to contain meat, a starch, and at least one vegetable, even when that vegetable had come from a can opened only minutes before serving. The bowl might be glass china, or a practical saucepan placed on a folded trivet when the kitchen had run out of serving dishes. Steam rose from the surface, butter shone between the pieces, and a serving spoon waited beside portions calculated to reach every plate. Sunday dinner was supposed to look abundant, but it was also supposed to look balanced. The vegetable bowl provided that appearance, whether anyone at the children's end of the table had requested assistance. What appeared in the bowl depended on season, region, income and access. Families with gardens might serve green beans cooked slowly, corn cut from the cob carrots, pulled from the ground peas, shelled at the kitchen table, or greens prepared according to local and family tradition. In rural households, home-canned vegetables could carry the previous summer into winter. Urban and suburban families increasingly relied on supermarket cans and frozen packages that made familiar vegetables available without washing soil from the sink or planning around the growing season. A can opener turned liquid drained into the basin, and the contents went into a saucepan with butter, salt, pepper, bacon, drippings, onion, or another seasoning the household preferred. Frozen peas or corn could move from a cardboard package into boiling water and reach the table quickly. Convenience reduced preparation, although someone still had to remember the vegetables before the meat was carved, and the potatoes were already waiting. Canned vegetables had a texture that many viewers remember more clearly than the labels. Green beans could become soft enough to bend over the serving spoon. Peas sometimes lost the bright colour suggested by the package. Corn retained more sweetness, while carrots could be glazed, buttered, or cooked until resistance seemed unnecessary. Some families preferred vegetables tender by modern standards, and considered crispness evidence that the cooking had not been completed. Others protected garden flavour with shorter cooking and fewer additions. There was no single 1960s method, although period meal planning frequently treated vegetables as dependable supporting players rather than the centre of dinner. Their task was to complete the plate, add colour, and reassure adults that the family had not been served meat and potatoes alone. The fact that the vegetables were sometimes covered with cheese sauce, bacon, butter, or gravy did not weaken this reassurance. It merely made cooperation more likely. Regional traditions gave the vegetable bowl a much larger story than one national Sunday menu could contain. In parts of the South, green beans seasoned with pork field peas, okra corn, sweet potatoes or cabbage might appear beside chicken ham or another main dish. Midwestern tables could include corn peas, carrots, or green beans from gardens, freezers, cans, and local markets. Coastal and immigrant households brought their own vegetable seasonings, cooking fats, and combinations shaped by family history. Some families served a salad before the main meal, or placed lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, or moulded salads directly on the table. Others considered a hot vegetable essential and a cold salad optional. The shared tradition was not one particular food. It was the expectation that Sunday dinner needed a vegetable presence large enough to be noticed, passed, and eventually discussed. When a child claimed to have eaten more than the plate clearly indicated, children developed methods for dealing with the vegetable requirement. Peas could be mixed into mashed potatoes arranged along the edge of the plate, or eaten one at a time in the hope that adults would become distracted. Green beans were cut into smaller pieces even when cutting did not improve the flavour. Corn usually received a warmer welcome, especially when served with butter, or directly from the cob, where eating it created enough activity to feel less like an obligation. Carrots could be accepted when sweetened, while cooked greens often divided the table according to age and family habit. Parents might require one spoonful, one bite, or a clean plate before dessert. Some allowed a child to avoid one disliked vegetable, but not all vegetables. Others refused to operate the kitchen as a restaurant. Sunday dinner offered more food than a weekday meal, but it did not necessarily offer more choice. Adults also had preferences, although they expressed them more politely. One relative wanted green beans cooked longer. Another considered canned peas unnecessary when frozen ones were available. A grandparent might compare every serving with vegetables from a former garden, a standard the supermarket could rarely meet. The cook listened to these judgments after selecting buying, preparing, and carrying the food to the table. Compliments were appreciated. Advice was easier to provide than to wash from a saucepan. Yet vegetables could carry genuine family memory. A particular seasoning serving bowl or method of cooking might belong to one grandmother, one region, or one household garden. The smell of onions softening with beans, corn warming with butter, or greens simmering in a covered pot could identify Sunday as clearly as the roast in the oven. What children resisted at 8 could become the flavour they tried to reproduce decades later. The vegetable bowls also helped stretch the meal. Generous spoonfuls filled the space around a smaller portion of meat and garden, produced reduced reliance on the grocery store during part of the year. Leftovers could return in soup casseroles, reheated plates, or combinations that were given a new name on Monday. The practical purpose never entirely displaced the social one. Passing vegetables taught children to wait, hold the bowl securely, and serve themselves without taking more than they would eat. Guests were encouraged to have another spoonful. The final portion remained available until someone asked whether anyone else wanted it. A serving dish that began full slowly revealed its patterned bottom, leaving only butter cooking liquid, and a few pieces no one wished to claim publicly. By the time the vegetables had travelled around the table, the Sunday plate had assumed its familiar shape, meat under gravy, potatoes beside it, colour gathered along the remaining edge, and perhaps a little space reserved for bread. That bread was rarely treated as decoration. Rolls, biscuits, or sliced loaves filled the basket, carried butter, gathered the last gravy, and offered another way to make a generous meal reach every appetite. The vegetables had completed the proper plate. Now the bread basket began its own journey before everything inside it had time to cool. The bread basket usually arrived covered with a folded napkin, carrying the kind of warmth that disappeared faster than anything else on the Sunday table. In many 1960s, Holmes rolls, biscuits, cornbread, or sliced bread were expected beside the roast potatoes, vegetables, and gravy, not because the plate lacked food, but because bread completed the meal in a way few families questioned. The basket might contain homemade yeast rolls with brown tops, baking powder biscuits split neatly at the middle, dinner rolls warmed from a package, or thick slices cut from a loaf purchased at the supermarket. Regional and family traditions decided the form, but the purpose was remarkably consistent. Bread-filled hungry spaces carried butter-absorbed gravy, and stretched the meal without calling attention to the grocery budget. It also created urgency. Meat could rest and vegetables could wait briefly, but a hot roll had only a small window before becoming an ordinary piece of bread. Homemade rolls required planning that began hours before dinner. Yeast had to be dissolved dough mixed and kneaded, and a bowl set somewhere warm enough for the first rise. The cook pressed the dough down, shaped it into rounds or knots, and arranged the pieces in a greased pan for another rise before baking. This work had to fit around the roast church-clothes potatoes and every other Sunday demand. Some families used recipes passed through generations, measured by habit rather than exact instruction. Others relied on community cookbooks, flour company booklets, or handwritten cards stained by butter at the corners. The finished rolls could be soft and light or slightly uneven with one side darker, because the oven heated differently near the back. Their appearance mattered less than the smell released when the pan came out. Warm yeast butter and browned flour could draw children into the kitchen before anyone had called them, which was useful proof that appetite survived even after repeated warnings not to spoil it. Biscuits offered a faster route to the bread basket, but still required a practiced hand. Flour shortening or buttermilk salt and leavening were mixed quickly, because too much handling could make the finished biscuits firm enough to discourage conversation. The dough was patted or rolled on a floured counter, then cut with a biscuit cutter, drinking glass, or whatever round object had earned the job. Scraps were pressed together for the final biscuit, which rarely looked as neat as the first and often became the cook's portion. In southern and other regional traditions, biscuits carried particular importance, while cornbread might take their place or appear beside them. In other households, sliced white bread or brown and serve rolls were entirely acceptable. Sunday dinner did not demand that every family bake from scratch. It demanded that the bread arrive ready to pass, preferably warm, and in sufficient quantity to survive the first trip around the table. Packaged rolls and refrigerated dough reflected the decades' growing confidence in convenience. A cardboard tube paper package or frozen tray promised consistent results, with less mixing, rising and flour on the counter. The cook still had to heat the oven, arrange the pieces, watch the clock and remember that bread could burn during the few minutes when gravy required complete attention. Convenience shortened the work but did not eliminate timing. Rolls often entered the oven near the end of the roast's cooking when every burner was occupied, and serving dishes were appearing from cabinets. Someone was assigned to watch them, a responsibility that sounded simple, until conversation, the telephone, or an arriving relative intervened. A pan of over-browned rolls could still be served with the darkest sides turned downward. Butter and a folded napkin restored much of their dignity. The butter dish was nearly as important as the basket. Butter might arrive cold and resistant, especially when removed from the refrigerator only after everyone sat down. A child tried to spread it across a soft roll, tore the bread in half and left a pale chunk sitting where cooperation had failed. More experienced cooks set the butter out earlier so it would soften, although warm kitchens could take the process farther than intended. Margarine was common in many households as well, shaped by price preference, wartime habits, advertising and changing ideas about food. Some families strongly preferred one over the other. Others used whatever was already on the table. The butter dish might match the better china, or be an ordinary saucer covered with a small lid. What mattered was that it travelled with the bread and did not remain at one end of the table, while everyone else waited politely. Bread also carried the flavours that might otherwise be left behind. A roll could be split and filled with a slice of meat, creating a small sandwich before the meal had officially ended. Biscuits were pulled apart and used to gather gravy from the plate. Cornbread absorbed cooking liquid from greens or beans. A piece of sliced bread performed the final clean-up around potatoes and sauce, reducing what remained to be scraped into the dishpan. Adults sometimes viewed this as practical eating, while etiquette-minded relatives preferred that the process remain controlled. Bread could touch gravy. It was not necessarily supposed to polish the plate with visible enthusiasm. Children learned the distinction by watching adults, and occasionally crossing it. The last piece in the basket created another manners problem. Taking it without asking was discouraged, so it remained under the napkin while several people hoped someone else would begin the required negotiation. The bread basket helped make Sunday dinner generous without making the meat platter larger. Flour, cornmeal, packaged rolls and sliced loaves could feed several people at a lower cost than another roast. A hungry teenager might take 2 rolls and leave more meat for younger children or guests. An unexpected relative could be served a full-looking plate because potatoes, vegetables and bread expanded around the central portion. This was household economy presented as hospitality. The table did not advertise what each item had cost. It simply offered enough different foods that everyone could find satisfaction somewhere. Bread was especially forgiving because leftovers remained useful. Rolls could become small sandwiches. Biscuits returned at breakfast with jam or gravy. Cornbread might be crumbled, reheated, or used in another dish. Even pieces beginning to dry could find another purpose before anyone considered them wasted. As the basket moved from person to person, it joined a larger traffic pattern already circling the table. Potatoes travelled one direction, vegetables another, gravy paused beside the person pouring it, and bread waited for an opening between heavier bowls. Passing these dishes required coordination, patience, and enough awareness not to send two large platters toward the same child at once. Sunday dinner was not only served family style, it moved family style hand to hand, with every bowl carrying both food and an expectation about how it should be handled. The rolls had to reach everyone before they cooled, but no one was supposed to rush. That delicate balance leads to the next tradition, when heavy platters began travelling around the table and children learned that passing dinner safely was part of eating it. The first heavy bowl left one pair of hands and entered another with a warning that usually arrived before the weight did. "Careful, it's hot," someone said, even when the serving dish was only warm, and the child receiving it had already been watching steam rise for several minutes. In many 1960s, home Sunday dinner was served family style, which meant that roast potatoes, vegetables, gravy, bread, and smaller dishes travelled around the table instead of arriving on plates prepared in the kitchen. The system made the meal feel generous because every person could see the food before taking a portion, but it also required coordination. A glass bowl filled with mashed potatoes was not passed casually. It was lifted with both hands held level above plates and drinking glasses and delivered to the next person without dipping a sleeve into the gravy. Children learned that eating Sunday dinner involved more than using a fork. They were temporarily responsible for household property hot food and the white tablecloth beneath both. The direction of travel could seem simple until several dishes began moving at once. One bowl started to the left, another moved to the right, and the bread basket waited between them for an opening. Someone requested the gravy from across the table, while the person nearest it was already holding the green beans. A platter paused behind a water glass because two adults had reached for it from different directions. Families often developed an unspoken system through repetition. Each person took a helping and passed the dish onward instead of returning it immediately to the center. The next person prepared to receive it before the first released the weight. Serving spoons remained inside the correct bowls, at least in theory, and handles were turned toward the next diner. The arrangement worked well because everyone had practiced it for years. It failed when a guest interrupted the pattern, a child became distracted, or a spoon slid suddenly across the surface and struck the rim with enough noise to make every head turn. Serving oneself carried rules of its own. Children were expected to take a reasonable amount, especially when guests or relatives were still waiting. A large spoonful could be accepted if the child intended to eat it. A mountain built from enthusiasm and abandoned later was another matter. The first trip around the table was about distribution rather than personal ambition. Everyone received meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread before second helpings began. Taking the final roll slice or spoonful often required a question: did anyone else want it? This small ceremony sometimes left one piece untouched, because several people wanted it, and none wished to appear selfish. An adult eventually divided it, offered it to a guest, or announced that someone should eat it before it went to waste. Sunday manners did not eliminate appetite. They required appetite to wait until fairness had been publicly considered. The dishes themselves shaped how carefully the meal moved. Glass and ceramic serving bowls could be surprisingly heavy before food was added. A long platter might require two hands and enough clearance to avoid glasses, candles, or a centerpiece that had seemed charming before dinner began. Metal or oven-proof dishes sometimes remained hot from the stove, and a folded towel or trivet travelled with them. Handles offered little protection when heat had spread through the entire dish. Adults usually passed the most difficult items across safer routes, while younger children received bread relishes or smaller bowls that could be managed without threatening the table. Even so, a child eventually encountered the test of holding the potato bowl while another person served from it. Arms tightened, the bowl tilted slightly, and every adult nearby became alert without wanting to frighten the child. Success earned no applause. It simply meant the potatoes continued their journey. Family-style service also gave the person who cooked a clear view of how the meal was being received. From one end of the table, the cook could watch which bowl emptied first, which vegetable remained nearly untouched, and whether the roast slices were thick enough for the remaining diners. A serving dish might be redirected before reaching the end because someone had been missed. More gravy could be brought from the kitchen. Extra rolls might be uncovered near the stove. The cook continued managing dinner even while seated, often through short questions and quiet instructions. Pass that to your grandfather. Leave some for your cousin. Use the spoon, not your fork. These corrections were practical, but they also taught the family how the table worked. Food was shared in a visible order, and every person was expected to help maintain that order. The system could be especially complicated when relatives filled every available chair. An extended table created long distances between the roast and the person requesting it. Dishes changed hands several times before reaching their destination, and messages travelled with them. At a separate children's table, smaller diners might receive portions prepared by an adult because the main platters were too heavy or valuable to circulate safely. Even there, bread, butter, and vegetables were passed according to rules learned from the larger table. Children observed who was served first, who received the favourite piece of chicken, and which guest was urged to take another helping. Hospitality became visible through serving. The family did not merely announce that company was welcome. It placed the best portions within reach, refilled glasses, and kept dishes moving until the guest had declined more than once. Not every household used family-style service. Small kitchens, limited table space, young children, or different cultural traditions could make kitchen-plated meals more practical. Some families placed food on a sideboard or counter where everyone served themselves. Others passed only certain dishes while the cook portioned meat and potatoes. The idealized dining table shown in magazines did not represent every home, but the broader expectation of sharing remained important. The food was not meant to appear as separate private meals. It came from common bowls and platters, and the act of passing it reminded everyone that the dinner had been prepared for the group. Each person's portion depended on what remained for the others. By the time the last bowl returned to the centre, the table had settled into a quieter rhythm. Plates were full, serving spoons rested against patterned rims, and hands no longer crossed above the cloth from every direction. The passing had done more than distribute food. It had required children to pay attention, adults to accommodate one another, and guests to enter a routine that belonged to the household. Yet the number of people around the table was not always limited to those who lived under the same roof. On many Sundays, grandparents, cousins, neighbours, and unexpected visitors expanded the gathering, bringing additional appetites, and forcing the family to search for chairs in rooms where chairs were not normally expected to dine. The extra chairs rarely matched. One came from the bedroom desk, another from the sewing machine, and a third might be carried in from the porch with a warning not to lean too far back. In many 1960s, home Sunday dinner expanded beyond the people who lived there every day. Grandparents arrived after church, cousins appeared with their parents, a neighbour was invited at the last minute, or an uncle who'd been expected later stepped through the door just as the roast was being carved. The table that looked adequate on Saturday suddenly needed another leaf, another place setting, and a careful reconsideration of how many slices remained on the platter. No one wanted a guest to feel that their arrival had caused trouble, so the trouble was managed quietly. Chairs were pulled from other rooms, potatoes were served generously, and the bread basket became even more important. Hospitality meant making the table appear ready for exactly the number of people who happened to be standing in the hallway. Extending the table could become a household operation. A hidden leaf was lifted from a closet basement or beneath the tabletop, then fitted into place while someone held the two halves apart. The tablecloth that had looked perfectly sized now seemed several inches too short, so it was centered again or replaced with a larger one. Extra plates came from the cabinets, sometimes matching the first set and sometimes not. A folding chair was opened with a metallic snap. Younger children were moved closer together and adults debated where a grandparent would be most comfortable. In homes without a separate dining room, furniture might be shifted against the wall to create enough walking space for serving bowls. The room changed shape around the gathering. Sunday dinner demonstrated that the official capacity of a table was only a suggestion made before relatives arrived. Grandparents often occupied places of quiet importance. A familiar chair might be reserved for a grandfather who preferred more room, or a grandmother who needed to sit near the kitchen. They could bring a dish of their own, even when told not to bring anything, because arriving empty-handed felt wrong. A covered bowl, pie carrier, casserole, or paper bag containing rolls entered the kitchen with them. Their recipes might differ slightly from the host's, and those differences were noticed. One grandmother's green beans cooked longer, another relative's pie crust was thinner. A grandfather added pepper before tasting, a habit everyone recognized and no one expected to change. The meal gave younger family members a repeated encounter with voices, stories, and table habits that belonged to an earlier generation. Long before children understood family history, they learned who wanted dark meat, who saved a biscuit for later, and who always asked whether the gravy contained enough salt. Cousins changed the atmosphere more dramatically. Adults could remain at the main table discussing work, church, weather, or family news, while children were assigned to a smaller card table nearby. The children's table might be covered with a different cloth and set with everyday dishes rather than the breakable ones. Its chairs were lower, its conversation louder, and its interpretation of table manners more experimental. Peas moved between plates, rolls were traded, and unwanted vegetables occasionally vanished beneath napkins with very little legal documentation. Older cousins supervised younger ones only when supervision improved their own standing with the adults. Being moved from the children's table to the adult table marked a small passage into maturity, though the promotion came with fewer jokes, closer observation, and the discovery that adult conversations could continue for a remarkable length of time after dessert was visible. Unexpected company tested the cook's ability to stretch a meal without making the adjustment obvious. Another potato could not be mashed after everyone was seated, but the existing bowl could be served a little more carefully. Roast slices became thinner. A can of vegetables might be warmed quickly, bread added to the basket, or a jar of pickles and relishes placed on the table to create another dish. In some families, the possibility of company was built into Sunday cooking from the beginning. The roast was chosen slightly larger, extra potatoes were peeled, and dessert was prepared in a pan that could survive generous cutting. This was not wasteful abundance so much as insurance against the doorbell. A household that welcomed relatives regularly learned to keep enough food flexible. Gravy stretched, meat bread stretched, everything, and conversation helped cover the few minutes required to make the table look intentional. Hospitality also followed rules. Guests were offered the first choice of meat, urged to take another helping, and reassured that there was plenty, even when the cook had already calculated Monday's leftovers disappearing from the platter. Children were expected to give up a preferred chair without complaint, and avoid announcing that a guest had received the last drumstick. Adults refilled coffee cups, moved the butter closer, and asked whether anyone needed more potatoes. A visitor might decline once from politeness and accept after a second invitation. The host had to encourage without turning dinner into a negotiation. At the same time, guests were expected to admire the food, avoid criticizing unfamiliar dishes, and notice the labor behind the table. Everything is delicious, performed useful social work, even when one vegetable had been cooked beyond recognition. Sunday hospitality depended on both sides protecting the meal from unnecessary honesty. The gathering was not always easy or sentimental. Relatives brought old disagreements, questions about school comments about children's growth, and opinions about cooking that had not been requested. A grandparent might enforce a table rule more strictly than the parents. An uncle could begin a story everyone had already heard. Cousins argued over seats, and a visiting child might reject food the household's own children were required to eat. Yet the crowded table also created memories that smaller weekday meals could not. People heard news before telephones made long conversations casual, saw relatives who lived across town or several counties away, and watched family customs repeat across generations. The meal provided a regular reason to gather without requiring a birthday, funeral, or holiday. Its importance came partly from repetition. The same chairs were carried in, the same people took familiar places, and the same stories returned with minor improvements. After dinner, the extra chairs remained as evidence of the crowd. One blocked the hallway, another stood beside the card table, and several waited to be returned to rooms that suddenly looked incomplete without them. Children moved outside or toward the living room while adults stayed over coffee. The tablecloth showed rings, crumbs, and the faint outline of serving dishes that had occupied nearly every inch. Sunday dinner had stretched to include everyone, but the guests had also brought another expectation into the room. Many arrived directly from church and remained in pressed shirts, dresses, polished shoes, or other clothes meant to stay clean. Around a table crowded with gravy, butter, and restless children, Sunday best faced its most dangerous hour. A polished shoe under the table and a bowl of gravy above it made an uneasy combination. In many 1960s, families' Sunday dinner followed church closely enough that everyone remained dressed in the clothes selected for the morning. Boys sat in pressed shirts, narrow ties, polished shoes, or jackets they had already been warned not to wrinkle. Girls might wear dresses with full skirts, white socks, gloves tucked into a handbag, or shoes that looked better than they felt. Adults remained in suits, hats set aside, carefully arranged hair and dresses chosen for public appearance rather than kitchen work. The family had returned home, but no one had fully returned to ordinary household life. Sunday best came to the table, with them placing clean cuffs, pale fabric, and carefully pressed hems within dangerous distance of butter, meat juices, coffee, and a gravy boat that had never respected clothing. Keeping those clothes clean began before anyone sat down. Children were often told not to change because dinner was nearly ready, a phrase that could mean 10 minutes or almost an hour. They waited in the living room, stood near the kitchen doorway, or attempted to play without touching the floor furniture one another, or anything capable of leaving a mark. A boy sent outside for a few minutes might return with dust on his knees. A girl's sash could catch on a chair or trail too close to a serving dish. The instruction to remain neat gave Sunday afternoon a special tension. Weekday clothing could survive a little gravy or grass. Church clothing had already required ironing, brushing, polishing, buttoning, and repeated warnings. A stain did not affect only the child wearing it. It created more work for the person who would later soak scrub wash dry and press the garment before it was needed again. Napkins therefore carried more responsibility than usual. A cloth napkin might be unfolded and placed across the lap, protecting a skirt, trousers, or dress from crumbs and small spills. Paper napkins were used in many homes as well, especially at less formal tables, but the rule remained similar. The napkin belonged in the lap rather than tucked into a collar, waved through conversation, or abandoned beside the plate. Younger children sometimes received additional protection from a bib towel or napkin arranged by an adult who understood the child's relationship with food. Sleeves were pushed back when possible. Jackets might be removed with permission, although some families expected them to remain on through the meal. A tie presented its own problem, hanging directly above soup gravy and mashed potatoes. The wearer learned to lean carefully or hold it aside, a small act of coordination that made Sunday dinner feel like a test of whether formal clothing had been designed by people who ever ate. The table itself created hazards in every direction. A serving spoon could drip while crossing a white cuff. Butter softened near a child's elbow. A glass sweated onto the cloth and became easier to slide than expected. The gravy boat was passed by its handle kept level and placed down only after someone made room. Children were reminded not to reach across another person's plate because reaching risked both manners and fabric. A sleeve brushing through mashed potatoes was bad enough. A sleeve carrying mashed potatoes back across the table expanded the problem considerably. Adults responded quickly to spills, lifting plates, moving glasses, and pressing a napkin against the cloth before the stain spread. The correction might be calm, but the silence around it revealed the seriousness of the event. Sunday best had survived church greetings, handshakes, and the ride home. It was not expected to surrender to peas. Clothing also reinforced the meal's formality. Sitting upright felt more natural in a pressed shirt or fitted dress than in play clothes. Children were discouraged from kneeling on chairs, swinging polished shoes, loosening collars dramatically, or leaning back until the chair balanced on two legs. Adults had their own discomforts, but displayed them more quietly. A suit jacket could become warm near the dining room radiator, or in a kitchen still heated by the oven. Stockings, girdles, stiff shoes, and carefully arranged hair were not designed for relaxation over a long meal. Yet remaining dressed preserved the sense that Sunday dinner belonged to the public face of family life. Relatives might arrive unexpectedly, photographs might be taken, or the family might visit someone afterward. Clothes signalled readiness for the wider community, even while everyone sat at home asking for another role. Not every household followed the same practice. Some families changed immediately after church, especially when children wanted to play outside or the cooking promised splatters. Others attended no service but still dressed more carefully for Sunday dinner because relatives were coming. Work uniforms, simple dresses, clean shirts, or ordinary household clothes could carry as much meaning as formal church clothing in families with different incomes and customs. Regional climate mattered too. Heavy suits and layers were less practical in warm weather, while winter Sundays required coats, overshoes, and garments that crowded hall closets before dinner. The tradition was not defined by one national costume. It was defined by the belief that Sunday deserved visible effort, and that the meal was important enough to delay the return to everyday clothes. Children often remember the discomfort as clearly as the food, a collar pressing against the neck, shoes pinching beneath the table, a skirt that had to be kept away from chair legs, or the warning that arrived whenever a hand reached too quickly. They also remember the relief that followed. Once relatives left or dinner ended, ties loosened. Shoes came off, dresses were hung carefully, and play clothes returned. The transformation marked the end of formality more clearly than the final bite of dessert. Sunday best had carried the family through the public and ceremonial portion of the day. Now it could be protected for another week. Yet the clothing at the table revealed something larger than neatness. Sunday dinner was never culturally identical across America. The dishes placed before those pressed sleeves could come from Southern African American, Italian American, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, immigrant, rural, urban, or regional family traditions, each shaped by its own memories and ingredients. The clothes helped make dinner look formal, but the food revealed who the family was. Beyond the roast and potatoes image waited a much wider Sunday table filled with recipes that had travelled across states, neighbourhoods, generations and oceans. The platter at the centre of a Sunday table could look completely different from one neighbourhood to the next. In one 1960s home, the main dish might be roast beef with potatoes and gravy. A few streets away, another family could be serving fried chicken, baked ham, pasta covered with long-simmered sauce chicken, and dumplings, beans with rice, brisket, fish, greens, cabbage, or a dish whose name rarely appeared in national magazines. Sunday dinner was a broad American tradition, but it was never one national menu. Geography, religion, race, immigration, family income, and the recipes carried by older generations shaped what appeared on the table. The ritual might be familiar relatives arriving, serving bowls, circulating children waiting for permission to leave. The flavours could belong to an entirely different family history. What looked like an ordinary Sunday meal from outside the house might contain recipes that had crossed an ocean, survived a migration, adapted to a supermarket, or changed because one ingredient became too expensive to use as generously as before. In many southern households, Sunday dinner could include fried or baked chicken ham, greens, green beans cooked with seasoning meat, macaroni and cheese sweet potatoes, cornbread, biscuits, rice, or another combination rooted in local custom. African American Sunday tables often carried recipes shaped by family memory, regional agriculture, church life, and generations of skill developed under unequal circumstances. Yet even within the same town, no two families prepared everything alike. One cook seasoned greens with smoked meat, another used a different method, and another served cabbage or beans instead. Fried chicken could be crisp and deeply browned in one kitchen, lighter in another, or replaced by baked chicken, because frying for a large group required time, oil, and close attention. Children learned quickly that the same dish tasted different at an aunt's house, a grandmother's table, or a church supper. Family recipes did not follow county lines neatly. They followed the hands that prepared them. In Italian-American homes, Sunday dinner might centre on pasta with a sauce that had simmered for hours, sometimes accompanied by meatballs, sausage, braciole, or another meat prepared according to regional and family tradition. The smell could begin early in the day, moving through an apartment or narrow city house, long before anyone sat down. Garlic, softened tomatoes cooked slowly, and a wooden spoon rested beside a pot large enough to feed relatives who had not yet confirmed whether they were coming. Some families called the sauce gravy, others did not, and the question could produce a discussion longer than the meal. Bread waited nearby to gather what remained on the plate, while grated cheese was passed with instructions about how much was enough. These meals reflected specific Italian regional roots, American ingredients and changes made over generations. A grandmother's version might differ from the recipe her daughter prepared, yet both could be defended as the only correct one. Other Sunday tables reflected Jewish, Polish, German, Irish, Greek, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Scandinavian, Eastern European, Asian American, Native, and countless other family traditions. A household might serve brisket, roast chicken, stuffed cabbage noodles, dumplings, beans, rice pork dishes, baked fish stews or breads associated with a particular community or region. Religious practice affected ingredients, preparation, and timing in some homes. Local markets determined what was available, while family budgets determined what could be purchased regularly. Immigration could change a recipe without erasing it. A traditional cheese might be replaced by one sold at the neighbourhood grocery. A cut of meat used in the old country might be unavailable or known by another name at an American butcher counter. Children sometimes believed the adapted version was ancient because it had existed for their entire lives. Family tradition often works that way. 3 decades can begin to sound like 3 centuries when the recipe belongs to a grandmother, The recipe itself was not always written down. It might live in a sequence of movements: brown the meat until it looks right, add enough water to cover the bottom, cook the onions until the smell changes, and stop adding flour when the dough feels correct. A younger relative who asked for measurements could receive answers such as "a little some or you'll know." These instructions were perfectly clear to the person who had made the dish every Sunday for 20 years, and nearly useless to everyone else. Recipe cards existed along with community cookbooks, newspaper clippings, flour company booklets, and magazine pages folded into kitchen drawers. But the most important details could remain unwritten. Which pan produced the best crust, whether the lid stayed on how the oven ran, and which relative disliked too much pepper. Preparing the dish beside an experienced cook was often the only reliable way to learn it. Sunday dinner also created a place where recipes could be judged, defended, and inherited. A visiting aunt noticed when the macaroni was drier than usual. A grandfather compared the dumplings with those made by someone no longer living. A child announced that another relative's pie was better, thereby learning that honesty and wisdom were separate qualities. Compliments often recognized more than flavor. Saying that a dish tasted like a mother's or grandmother's version connected the cook to the family line. Failing to reproduce that flavor could feel personal, even when the missing ingredient was simply the old stove, a particular pan, or memory itself. Recipes changed because cooks changed. One used less fat, another relied on a packaged ingredient, and another shortened the cooking time to fit paid work or children's schedules. The meal remained traditional even as its method moved quietly with the decade. National food companies and supermarkets influenced these family dishes without completely replacing them. Canned tomatoes, condensed soups, frozen vegetables, boxed pasta, packaged seasonings, and prepared dough entered recipes that families still considered their own. Convenience could reduce labor, make ingredients available year-round, or help a cook reproduce a familiar meal in a new city. It could also create disagreement. An older relative might object to a shortcut that everyone else considered sensible. A younger cook might follow a magazine recipe and discover that the family preferred the version no cookbook had recorded. The 1960s kitchen stood between inherited practice and expanding consumer choice. Sunday dinner became one of the places where those forces met. A modern package could enter an old recipe, disappear beneath sauce or seasoning, and emerge at the table carrying a family name rather than a brand name. What made these meals American was not that they became identical. It was that so many traditions occupied the same country, sometimes the same block, while families continued to call their own version Sunday dinner. The roast and potatoes image remained familiar, but it represented only one corner of the table. Across the decades, Sunday meals preserved languages, migration stories, religious customs, local crops, and the preferences of relatives whose names might never appear in a cookbook. The food told children where their family had been even when no one explained the history directly. A smell from the kitchen could do the work of a map, and after the meat, pasta, vegetables, breads, and family specialties had filled the table, another recipe often waited beyond the dinner plates. It might have been baked the previous evening, chilled overnight, or covered carefully so no child could remove a piece before company arrived. Sunday dessert required its own planning, and in many homes the pie or cake was already finished before Sunday morning had even begun. The dessert was often waiting before the roast ever entered the oven. In many 1960s households, the pie, cake, cobbler, pudding, or chilled dessert for Sunday dinner had been prepared on Saturday when the kitchen could give it more attention. Sunday morning already belonged to dressing church relatives, vegetables, gravy, and the difficult business of getting several hot foods ready at the same time. Adding a layer cake or fruit pie to that schedule could turn a busy kitchen into a place where every surface held a bowl, and every oven rack had been promised to something else. Preparing dessert a day early solved part of the problem. A cake cooled beneath a cover, a pie rested on a shelf or a refrigerator dish firmed overnight while the household slept. By Sunday afternoon, dessert appeared calm and complete, concealing the flour on Saturday's counter, and the child who had already asked 3 times whether anyone would notice a missing corner. Pie carried a particular sense of Sunday because it required several stages of work. Dough was mixed, chilled or rested, rolled across a floured board, and lifted carefully into a metal glass or ceramic plate. Fruit might come from a garden orchard, freezer jar or supermarket can, depending on the season and the household. Apples were sliced and sweetened with sugar and cinnamon. Cherries, peaches, berries, or other fruit were thickened enough to remain inside the crust rather than escape across the oven floor. Cream and custard pies demanded different care, while lemon or chocolate fillings could be topped with meringue that looked impressive until beads of moisture appeared on the surface. A pie did not need to be perfect to be welcomed. One edge might brown faster than the other, juice might bubble through the top crust, and the first slice could collapse while being lifted. Once placed beside coffee and praised by a guest, structural difficulties became less important. Layer cakes made a different promise. They looked generous before anyone had taken a bite, especially when displayed beneath a glass dome or carried to the table on a raised plate. Some were mixed from family recipes with flour, sifted shortening creamed eggs, added one at a time, and bowls scraped carefully so nothing useful remained behind. Boxed cake mixes were also familiar in many kitchens by the 1960s, offering reliable proportions and fewer canisters to open. They did not remove all the work. The cook still greased the pans, watched the oven loosen the layers, waited for them to cool and spread frosting without pulling crumbs across the surface. A cake frosted while warm could slide, tear, or behave as though the top layer had somewhere else to be. Preparing it on Saturday allowed time for repairs. Extra frosting covered many historical events that the family never needed to know about. Dessert choices reflected region, season, income, and family identity just as strongly as the main meal. One family expected apple pie, another coconut cake, pound cake, banana pudding, cobbler bread, pudding rice pudding, or a chilled gelatin dessert. Some homes served fruit in summer and heavier baked sweets during colder months. Others kept the same favourite throughout the year because Sunday tradition valued repetition more than variety. A grandmother might bring the cake she was known for, removing pressure from the host while also ensuring that no one else attempted her specialty. Community cookbooks, newspaper columns, magazine pages, and recipe booklets offered new combinations, but familiar desserts usually carried the strongest authority. A child might admire a glossy refrigerator creation in an advertisement and still ask whether the usual chocolate cake would be on the table. Chilled desserts suited advanced preparation particularly well. Puddings, gelatin, moulds, icebox cakes, and layered refrigerator dishes could be assembled on Saturday and left to set overnight. Their appeal came partly from convenience and partly from presentation. A moulded dessert reflected the dining room light, a pudding developed a smooth surface beneath wax paper, and an icebox cake softened as cookies or cake layers absorbed cream. Package mixes and prepared ingredients helped shorten some steps, though the final result could still require bowls, beaters, refrigerator space, and faith in the instructions. Refrigerator space was often the greatest challenge. The dessert had to compete with milk bottles or cartons, covered vegetables, leftovers, butter dishes, and the roast waiting for morning. A cake placed too near a strongly scented food could acquire a family story no recipe had intended. Until dinner ended, the dessert was protected. Children were discouraged from lifting covers, sampling frosting, removing fruit, or opening the refrigerator merely to confirm that the pie remained where it had been 10 minutes earlier. A cake with a damaged edge could be turned toward the wall. A missing cookie from an icebox dessert was more difficult to explain. The rule was simple dessert belonged to the table, not to the person who happened to enter the kitchen first. This gave it emotional power. It waited while the family attended church, carved meat past vegetables, and followed table manners. Everyone knew it was coming, but it remained unavailable until the main meal had been respected. Sunday dinner could be generous, yet it still maintained a clear order. Dessert was not simply another dish. It was the final course, and for children, the strongest argument for cooperating with everything before it. Serving dessert required another small transformation of the table. Dinner plates were removed, crumbs brushed aside, and forks or spoons redistributed. The pie server entered at an angle beneath the first slice, which was always the most difficult, and sometimes emerged in several pieces. Cake portions were judged according to age appetite, and whether enough needed to remain for later. Adults might request a thin slice, and then accept one that was not especially thin. Children studied the size of neighbouring portions with the concentration of accountants. Whipped cream ice cream sauce or a spoonful of fruit could make the dessert feel even more special, though many cakes and pies needed nothing beyond the plate. Compliments travelled back toward the baker, who might explain that the crust had not behaved properly, or that the cake was slightly dry. The family generally continued eating through this report. The dessert prepared on Saturday also extended Sunday beyond the main meal. Remaining slices waited under a cover for evening supper, visiting relatives, or Monday lunch. A piece of cake wrapped carefully could appear in a school lunchbox. Pie might be served after a lighter supper, giving children another reason to become hungry again. The work of one afternoon had produced several small occasions which helped justify the time and ingredients invested in it. Yet immediately after the first Sunday slices were served, the adults often reached for something hot and dark to accompany them. Cups returned to the table, the sugar bowl moved within reach, and the percolator's familiar aroma began to mingle with fruit spice and frosting. Dessert marked the end of eating. Coffee ensured that the gathering itself did not end nearly so quickly. The coffee often announced itself before the dessert plates were cleared. In many 1960s homes, a percolator had been working in the kitchen while pie was sliced or cake passed around the table, sending out a dark roasted smell that mixed with cinnamon frosting fruit and the fading aroma of dinner. The sound was familiar water rising through the stem, bubbling against the glass knob, and returning to the pot again and again until someone decided the colour looked right. Stovetop percolators remained common while electric models offered the appealing promise that coffee could manage itself. In practice, someone still measured the grounds, filled the pot, found the cord, watched for readiness, and carried a hot vessel into a room already crowded with cups and serving dishes. Coffee did not simply accompany dessert. It changed the pace of Sunday dinner. Once the cups appeared, no one expected the gathering to end quickly. The cups might come from the same set as the better dishes, or they might be a collection accumulated through wedding gifts, grocery promotions, replacements, and survival. Saucers were placed beneath them, partly for appearance, and partly because coffee had a way of reaching places it had not been poured. A sugar bowl moved around the table with a small spoon inside. Cream milk or canned milk appeared in a matching cream or a glass pitcher, or the carton brought from the refrigerator when no one wished to create another dish to wash. Some adults took coffee black, a preference that could be stated with the seriousness of a personal principle. Others added sugar until the spoon stood briefly in the centre, then poured in enough cream to change the cup from brown to tan. Children were usually offered milk water, or perhaps a tiny cup containing more milk than coffee, if adults considered them old enough to participate in the ritual without remaining awake until Monday. Coffee provided a reason for adults to remain at the table after the main work of eating had ended. Dinner plates were stacked, dessert crumbs collected, and chairs adjusted into more comfortable positions. The first cups were poured, followed by second cups that arrived almost automatically. Conversation moved away from the meal and toward the family's weekly business. Who was ill, who had changed jobs, whose child had done well in school, which cousin might be getting married, whether the weather would damage crops and what repairs the house required before winter. News travelled differently when relatives spoke face to face. Long-distance telephone calls could be expensive letters, took time, and everyday details often waited for the next visit. Sunday coffee gave those details room. A story could be interrupted, corrected by another relative, and resumed with added information that had not been requested, but was apparently essential. Children experienced this extended conversation from several distances. Younger ones might remain at the table because dessert was not finished, or because permission to leave had not yet been granted. Older children moved toward the living room porchyard or children's table, while still hearing the rise and fall of adult voices. They learned family history accidentally. Names of relatives they had never met appeared in stories. Old disagreements surfaced in carefully edited form. Adults discussed money, health work, and neighborhood events while assuming the children were not listening. Children were nearly always listening, especially when their own names entered the conversation. A sudden silence from the next room could indicate that someone had heard too much. More often, the children continued playing while storing fragments of information whose meaning would not become clear until years later. The pace of coffee also allowed hospitality to continue after the food had stopped moving. A guest's cup was refilled before it became empty. The host asked whether anyone wanted another slice of pie even when the answer had already been no. A small plate of cookies, nuts, or candy might appear, because apparently cake alone had left the table in danger of seeming ungenerous. Visitors declined, politely accepted eventually, and then explained that they truly could not eat another bite while continuing to eat. The pot returned to the kitchen for more coffee, or a second batch was prepared when the gathering was large. One cup became two, and two could become three if conversation found a subject nobody wished to abandon. Sunday dinner had already required hours of preparation, yet its social ending could last almost as long as the eating itself. Coffee brands and brewing preferences could inspire firm household loyalties. Some families purchased the same can, repeatedly stored it beside the stove, and recognized the painted label from across the grocery aisle. Others chose according to price coupons or what the local store stocked. Grounds were measured with a scoop spoon, or the practiced estimate of someone who'd made the same pot for years. Too few produced a pale cup that relatives described carefully. Too many made coffee strong enough to become a topic of conversation on its own. Percolation time mattered, and a pot left working too long could turn bitter. Still, adults often accepted a less-than-perfect cup because Sunday coffee was about more than flavour. It was warm, familiar, and available in quantity. It gave hands something to hold and the gathering a reason not to break apart immediately. The ritual carried its own division of labour. One person collected cups, another poured, and someone else carried cream and sugar from place to place. In many homes, the woman who had already planned cooked, served and monitored dinner, continued tending the coffee while everyone else settled into conversation. A relative might help by clearing plates or carrying the pot, but assistance depended on family custom. The person serving coffee could spend much of the first round standing, noticing who needed a refill before pouring a cup for herself. The labour looked small compared with roasting meat or washing pans, yet it extended the host's responsibility through the final stage of the meal. Sunday hospitality did not end when guests were full. It ended when they stood gathered coats and resisted one last offer of something to take home. Eventually the coffee cooled in the cups, conversation reached a natural pause, and chairs began moving away from the table. adults carried saucers toward the kitchen, while children were called back from other rooms. The long meal had lasted through roast vegetables, dessert, and several family stories, but the table was not yet finished with everyone. Plates needed stacking, glasses needed carrying, and crumbs had found their way beneath nearly every chair. Before anyone disappeared completely into the afternoon, children were often required to ask permission, clear their places, and prove that leaving the table was a privilege, followed by one final duty. The question usually came after a child had finished eating, or had decided that finishing was no longer a realistic goal. "May I be excused" was more than a request to leave the chair. In many 1960s households, it marked the final test of Sunday table manners. The child had already waited for everyone to sit, passed heavy bowls, kept elbows under control, and survived the vegetable portion of the meal. Now, departure required permission from an adult who might still be drinking coffee or listening to a relative's story. Simply standing up was considered abrupt. Sliding silently beneath the table was considered worse. The child waited for an answer, and sometimes received a question in return. Had the plate been finished? Had dessert been served? Or was everyone about to leave anyway? Sunday dinner was a family gathering, which meant that a child's personal schedule could not always overrule the conversation still unfolding around the cups. Permission depended partly on what remained on the plate. Many families expected children to eat what they had taken, particularly when food had required time and money to prepare. A few peas, a strip of fat, or the last spoonful of potatoes could delay release from the table. Some parents enforced a strict clean plate rule. Others required only a reasonable effort, one taste of each dish, or an honest attempt before dessert. Household customs varied, and memories of them vary just as strongly. For one child, Sunday dinner meant sitting before a cold vegetable long after everyone else had finished. For another, it meant quietly transferring an unwanted portion to a sibling who considered the exchange excellent business. Adults often saw waste as more than poor manners. Many had grown up during leaner years, watched grocery costs closely, or understood how much labor stood behind the serving bowls. Children saw 3 remaining green beans. Adults saw shopping, trimming, cooking. And the reason someone had said to take a little first. Dessert complicated the negotiation. A child who claimed to be completely full during the vegetable course could recover with remarkable speed when cake appeared. Parents noticed this medical miracle, and sometimes required the unfinished food to be addressed before pie was served. Other households allowed dessert regardless, particularly when company was present, and no one wished to conduct a public trial over carrots. Sunday rules could soften when grandparents visited, although they could also become stricter if a grandparent believed the table discipline had recently declined. The child learned to read the room. A mother's expression, a father's pause over the coffee cup, or a grandmother's glance toward the plate could reveal whether another bite was advisable. The words "may I be excused" were therefore delivered with careful timing, usually after plates had been cleared from neighbouring places, and before anyone remembered an additional duty. Once permission was granted, the chair had to be moved without scraping violently across the floor or trapping the tablecloth beneath one leg. The napkin came out of the lap and was placed where the household expected it, either beside the plate on the plate or in a basket destined for laundry. Then came the plate itself. In many families, children were expected to carry their own dishes to the kitchen, rather than leave everything for the adults. A plate could be balanced with silverware resting across it, though forks had a habit of sliding toward the edge during the walk. Glasses required another trip or a second hand, which introduced new risks. The route from dining room to sink might pass behind chairs around visiting relatives, and through a doorway where someone else was carrying a coffee pot in the opposite direction. Children were told to walk, hold the plate level, and avoid scraping leftovers onto the floor. The journey covered only a few yards, yet it briefly turned every crumb into cargo. The kitchen destination differed from one home to another. A child might place the plate beside the sink, scrape it into a garbage bowl, or stack it carefully with the others. In households without a garbage disposal, bones, fat, and scraps were separated according to family practice. Some leftovers were saved for another meal, some went into the trash, and some were handled in ways shaped by pets' gardens or rural household routines. Children were not always trusted to decide which category applied. A half slice of meat could still become a sandwich while a chewed roll had completed its public service. An adult might stand near the sink directing traffic. Silverware here, glasses there, do not place the good plate beneath the roasting pan. Sunday dishes were more numerous and sometimes more fragile than weekday dishes, so helpfulness required instruction. A child who dropped a fork made noise. A child who dropped a china plate created family history. Carrying the plate also signalled membership in the household rather than guest status. Visiting children might be told to leave their dishes while the family's own children were expected to help. Older siblings gathered glasses, younger ones carried napkins, and someone returned repeatedly for serving spoons forgotten on the table. These duties were rarely equal in every family. Girls were often assigned more kitchen work in households shaped by traditional expectations, while boys might be excused sooner or directed toward another chore. Other families divided the work by age convenience or whichever child had not disappeared quickly enough. The unfairness of these arrangements was sometimes obvious even then. Yet children also learned practical habits through them. How to stack without chipping, how to carry hot dishes with the towel, and how to recognize that a meal did not clean itself simply because adults had stopped eating. Not every child welcomed the responsibility. The living room, yard, cousins, radio or television waited beyond the dining room, and each trip to the kitchen increased the chance of receiving another assignment. A child who moved too slowly might be told to finish clearing the table. One who moved too quickly could be called back for the glass left behind. The most advanced strategy was to ask permission, carry one plate with visible cooperation, and then become difficult to locate. Parents had developed countermeasures. A name called from the kitchen could reach the far end of the house with surprising accuracy. Sunday dinner had gathered the family around one table, and clean-up gathered at least part of it around the sink. When the final child had been excused, the dining room changed quickly. Chairs stood at uneven angles, napkins lay beside empty places, and serving bowls contained the small portions no one had claimed. The formal stage of dinner was over, but the household's work had entered its least decorative phase. Roasting pans needed soaking, good dishes needed careful washing, leftovers needed covering, and a mountain of cups, forks, platters, and bowls waited beside the sink. Asking permission and carrying a plate had been the child's final duty at the table. In the kitchen, however, the adults and older children were only beginning the familiar division of labour that followed every Sunday feast. The kitchen, after Sunday dinner, looked nothing like the room that had produced the meal. The roast platter was nearly bare, the gravy boat had developed a brown line around its rim, and serving spoons rested at odd angles inside bowls that had once looked formal. In many 1960s homes the table might be cleared quickly, but the work of dinner continued around the sink for another hour or more. Plates arrived in stacks, cups gathered beside their saucers, and the roasting pan waited with a dark layer of drippings baked firmly to the bottom. A rubber or plastic dishpan might be filled with hot water, and suds, especially in kitchens without a divided sink, while a draining rack and folded towels claimed the counter nearby. Sunday dinner had been presented as a calm family occasion. Cleanup revealed the equipment, labour, and accumulated grease required to create that calm. The meal had ended for the people drinking coffee in the next room. For the person standing at the sink, it had merely changed form. Before washing began, the dishes had to be sorted. Leftover meat was lifted from the platter and placed on a smaller plate or in a refrigerator container. Potatoes, vegetables, rolls, and gravy were examined to determine what could be saved for Monday and what had reached the end of its usefulness. Bones might be reserved for soup in some households, while scraps were handled according to family custom, local waste systems, pets, gardens, or rural routines. Serving bowls were scraped carefully because one spoonful of potatoes could become a potato cake, and several slices of roast could become sandwiches. Wax paper, aluminum, foil covered glass dishes or reusable containers protected what remained. The refrigerator door opened and closed repeatedly, as someone rearranged milk jars and earlier leftovers to create room. Sunday dinner had occupied the table generously. In storage, it had to become compact, stackable, and clearly understood before anyone forgot what was beneath the foil. The washing order followed a logic learned through repetition. Glasses and cups usually went first while the water was cleanest, followed by silverware, plates, serving bowls, and finally the greasy cookware. Good dishes received special treatment. They might be washed by hand, even in homes with a dishwasher kept away from heavy pans, and placed gently into the rack rather than stacked where one careless movement could chip an edge. A wedding pattern or inherited serving bowl carried more than replacement value, and children helping at the sink were reminded of this before being allowed to touch it. The roasting pan came last. Hot water loosened part of the residue, but stubborn areas required soaking scraping cleanser and patient pressure from a cloth or steel wool pad where appropriate. The same browned material that had enriched the gravy now behaved as though it had signed a permanent lease. Sunday cooking transformed inexpensive ingredients into dinner. Sunday cleanup transformed alms into evidence that the process was not effortless. In many households, the labor was divided according to age, gender, and long-established expectations. One person washed while another dried. Older children carried dishes from the table, put silverware into drawers, or returned bowls to cabinets. A relative might offer to help, only to be told to remain seated, then offer again until the host accepted or refused with greater authority. Women and girls were often expected to perform more of this work in families shaped by conventional domestic roles, even when they had already spent much of the day preparing the meal. Men and boys might clear the table handle, the roasting pan take out trash, or disappear toward the living room depending on the household. These arrangements were not universal, and many families divided the work differently. Still, the familiar image of adults relaxing while the cook continued in the kitchen reflected a real imbalance in numerous homes. The Sunday table celebrated family togetherness, but the cleanup could reveal exactly whose time made that togetherness possible. The drying towel moved constantly. It passed over plates, cups, serving spoons, and the outside of glasses that still held drops near the base. A good dryer learned to inspect rims, avoid placing damp dishes into cabinets, and keep silverware from slipping onto the floor. The towel itself gradually became wetter until it spread moisture more effectively than it removed it. Another was pulled from a drawer, often one already softened by years of washing, and decorated with check stripes, flowers, or a calendar printed by a local business. Conversation continued over the dishpan. Family news discussed politely at the table might be reconsidered more honestly in the kitchen. Compliments were repeated, irritations released, and plans made for returning borrowed dishes or using the leftovers. The people drying and washing sometimes shared the most relaxed conversation of the day because the formal meal was over and their hands already knew what to do. Cleanup also restored the kitchen one section at a time. Crumbs were shaken from the tablecloth or brushed into a hand stains treated before they could set, and the cloth folded for laundry. The table was wiped, leaves removed, and extra chairs returned to bedrooms, desks, or porches. Salt and pepper shakers went back to their usual place. The butter was covered and refrigerated. The floor beneath the children's table revealed peas crumbs, and evidence that at least one unwanted vegetable had completed an unauthorized journey. A broom passed beneath chair legs, followed by a damp cloth or mop if gravy or milk had reached the floor. The stove received attention after the pans were gone, burners wiped, splatters removed, and knobs checked. Sunday dinner had temporarily expanded the household into a place of ceremony. Cleanup reduced it to ordinary size again. By the time the final dish was returned to the cabinet, the dining room no longer looked as though a dozen people had occupied it. The sink emptied, the dishpan drained, and the wet towels were hung over a rack oven handle or lined to dry. The refrigerator now held covered portions of the meal arranged without ceremony, but full of future possibilities. The work had been long, yet it prevented Sunday dinner from ending in waste. Washing preserved the dishes, covering preserved the food. Restoring the room prepared the household for Monday morning, when breakfast would return to the same table, and the week would begin again. That was the final secret of the Sunday feast it rarely belonged to. Sunday alone. The roast slices, potatoes, gravy, vegetables, and bread stored behind the refrigerator door were already becoming tomorrow's sandwiches, hash soup, packed lunches, or reheated supper. The tablecloth had been cleared and the good dishes put away, but the meal continued working for the family. Sunday dinner ended at the sink. Its leftovers carried the household quietly into Monday. By Monday morning, Sunday dinner had changed its clothes. The roast no longer sat proudly at the centre of the table, the gravy boat had returned to the cabinet, and the white tablecloth was waiting for laundry. What remained was arranged behind the refrigerator door, beneath wax paper, aluminum foil, or a fitted lid, several slices of meat, a small bowl of potatoes, a spoonful of vegetables, and enough gravy to make one more meal feel deliberate. In many 1960s homes, these leftovers were not treated as the tired remains of an occasion. They were ingredients with another day's work ahead of them. A Sunday roast represented too much planning, cooking, and grocery money to disappear after one sitting. Before school and work began, someone opened the refrigerator, assessed the covered dishes, and quietly decided how Sunday would return on Monday. The simplest return was the sandwich. Thin slices of roast beef, ham, pork, or chicken were placed between pieces of white wheat rye, or homemade bread, sometimes with mustard, mayonnaise, pickles, lettuce, or whatever the household normally used. A sandwich could be wrapped in wax paper, tucked into a metal lunchbox, and carried to school, an office, a factory, or a construction site. By noon, the bread might have absorbed some moisture from the meat, and the neat package prepared in the kitchen could look less impressive beneath the lunchroom light. It still carried the flavour of Sunday. A child might compare it with a classmate's peanut butter sandwich, while an adult ate it beside coffee from a thermos. The special platter was gone, but the meat remained useful because it could travel. Sunday dinner had become portable without losing its identity completely. At home, leftover meat could return in a more ambitious form. It might be chopped with potatoes and onions for hash browned in a skillet, until the edges became crisp and the kitchen smelled substantial again. Gravy could be loosened with a little water milk or broth, and poured over reheated slices, toast biscuits, or mashed potatoes. Chicken could be removed from the bone and added to soup or casserole sandwiches, or a creamed mixture served over bread. Ham reappeared beside eggs in beans, or inside a sandwich carried through another day. These transformations varied by region and household, but they shared one practical idea: the cook did not have to begin Monday's supper with an empty pan and an entirely new plan. The hardest and often most expensive part of the meal had already been prepared. Monday's task was to make it look as though returning food had arrived under a new name. Potatoes were equally willing to continue. Mashed potatoes could be shaped into small cakes dusted lightly with flour and browned in a skillet. Roasted potatoes might be sliced and fried with onions, while boiled ones could enter soup or another mixed dish. Vegetables joined casseroles, soups, reheated plates or combinations held together by sauce. Rolls became sandwiches or returned at breakfast with butter and jam. Even the final spoonful of gravy could connect several modest leftovers into something that felt like supper rather than evidence from the refrigerator. The transformation did not always succeed equally. Reheated potatoes could become stiff bread could dry, and vegetables that had already been cooked thoroughly on Sunday rarely developed new enthusiasm by Monday. Still, careful seasoning a hot skillet and the proper amount of gravy could restore enough dignity for the family table. These meals reflected household thrift, but thrift did not necessarily mean deprivation. Reusing Sunday food was a way of respecting the work and ingredients already invested in it. Many adults who managed family kitchens had learned not to discard edible food merely because it had lost its first presentation. Grocery budgets had to cover the full week, and leftovers reduced both waste and Monday labor. The cook who had spent Sunday morning seasoning meat peeling potatoes and coordinating the oven could prepare the next meal with fewer steps. That mattered in households where Monday brought school schedules, paid employment, laundry errands, and the return of weekday pressure. Sunday dinner had been formal and expansive. Monday supper needed to be reliable. The covered bowls in the refrigerator provided a head start that no advertisement could make entirely effortless. Though advertisements continued to make an admirable attempt, children did not always appreciate this economy. A roast welcomed on Sunday could seem suspicious when it returned for the third time. Monday's sandwich might be accepted, Tuesday's hash tolerated, and Wednesday's soup examined as though the meat were attempting to avoid recognition. Families developed humor and strategy around the process. A new sauce, different bread, melted cheese, or a change from plate to bowl could make familiar ingredients appear less familiar. Some cooks openly called the meal leftovers. Others gave it a proper name and allowed no further investigation. Children learned that asking what was in a casserole did not guarantee an answer they would enjoy. They also learned that meals were connected. The food on Sunday's platter had consequences, and wasting it meant wasting part of the household's money and labor. Safe storage practices and refrigerator conditions differed among homes, and not every leftover was kept. Cooks relied on sight smell habit and the equipment available to them, sometimes with less guidance than families would receive later. Foods that could be cooled and refrigerated properly were covered and saved, while questionable portions were discarded. The refrigerator itself had become increasingly central to weekly meal planning, but space remained limited. A large roasting pan could not occupy an entire shelf until Tuesday. Meat was removed, bones separated, and side dishes transferred into smaller containers. This compression marked the final stage of Sunday dinner. The abundance displayed for relatives became a practical row of covered portions, each assigned another purpose, before the week moved too far ahead. By Monday evening, the family might sit at the same table beneath the ordinary light, using everyday plates and speaking about school or work. There was no pressed cloth, no ceremonial carving, and no expectation that relatives would arrive. Yet the taste of Sunday remained in the sandwich hash soup or gravy spread over toast. The meal had changed form because the household had changed pace. That was one reason these Sunday traditions mattered. They were not isolated performances created only for nostalgia. They organized shopping, cooking, visiting manors, labor, and several meals that followed. The 1960s Sunday table was never identical in every American home. Some families gathered after church, some later in the day, and some not at all. The centerpiece might be roast beef, fried chicken, pasta, beans, fish, or a family dish that belonged to one neighborhood more than to any national picture. The dishes could be fine china or ordinary plates. The chairs might match or arrive from every room in the house. What connected these traditions was the effort to turn one weekly meal into a shared occasion, then preserve its usefulness after the occasion had passed. The roast entered the oven before morning plans were complete. The table filled with relatives, bowls, prayers, rules, and conversation. The dishpan received what remained of the ceremony, and the refrigerator carried its practical memory into Monday. Today, some of those meals survive at holidays, restaurants, family reunions, or in kitchens where Sunday dinner never disappeared. Others live mainly in the smell of onions and meat from an oven, the sight of a gravy boat on a high cabinet shelf, or a handwritten recipe card whose instructions assume the cook already understands the difficult parts. The traditions were not perfect, and the labour behind them was not always shared fairly. But they reveal the patience budgeting adaptation and repeated care hidden inside an ordinary family meal. The tablecloth has been folded, the extra chairs returned, and the last sandwich wrapped for Monday. What remains is the memory of a house that smelled like dinner before anyone opened the door.